Okay, this is going to be part 2 of Who Painted the Negro Red. If the sound or anything isn't working right, please let me know. I'm going to take a look at the chat rather than last time where I messed up and never even looked at the chat when people were asking me questions. And I'd also like to thank the guys from Myth of the 20th Century. They just dropped the episode that we recorded a few days ago. Just want to thank them again for the opportunity to work with them on their project because it's one of the best things going. Okay, we're going to be on page 40 of this book. If you didn't see the first episode, this is a transcription of some stuff that was happening in the Louisiana State Legislature in 1957, March 6th through 9th. Some of the senators and representatives at the state legislature were worried about desegregation. Willie Rainach, who's the guy to my left here, he was an ardent foe of integration, and he viewed it as a communist conspiracy against the state of Louisiana and the United States. So he and some other people brought in this guy to my right here, Joseph Kornfeder, who in the first episode I said was either a Hungarian or Slovak, but he's actually an ethnic Austrian who was born in Slovakia. He immigrated to the United States, and in the early 19-teens, in the late 19-teens and early 1920s, he was a high-level communist organizer and agent of the Soviet Union. Later on in his life, he converted to anti-communism, and he spent about 10 years going around on lecture tours and giving talks and doing things like this, where he would tell the public and other interested parties what the activities were of the Communist Party in the United States, what they were up to, and why they were doing what they were doing. So in the first part of this, we talked about the general strategy of the Communist Party in the United States with regards to the American blacks. And we also talked about how the Communist Party specifically undermined Marcus Garvey and the Pan-Africanists, the African nationalists, because that represented a threat to the communists' goal of trying to use the American Negro as a tool to promote communism in the United States and to undermine the West. And I offered quite a bit of commentary last time to say that, the relationship between, or the comparison between all of this stuff and the Black Lives Matter things that we see recently, it's all pretty obvious. People are using the American black for purposes that the American black does not understand. These people are malicious, malignant, they operate at high levels, and this has all been done before. It's being done again. So we're going to be on page 40, and I recommend that you can get this book yourself through interlibrary loan or something like that and read it if you'd like. And I'm sure there's plenty of other good books out there too that are just as interesting, so maybe you want to do that instead of look at the same one. So we're going to have Rainach here asking, you were in charge of this operation for the Communist Party. Is that correct? Kornfeder replies, I was the one who directed the whole thing. Rainach asks, I noticed from the Communist Party Negro literature on hand that we have in our possession that the party has created a number of Negro fronts, and these fronts have a following among the Negroes, and that these fronts come and go under different names. They are apparently created and liquidated one after another. Can you tell us what is the reason intended behind this particular type of operation? And so a sidebar real quick. You know how NGOs and nonprofits and all these different foundations and everything operate. It's exactly the same way. They'll come up with different organizations, they'll be around for a short amount of time, they'll do some type of subversive activity, and then they'll disappear after a year or two only to be replaced by something else. So a lot of researchers, what they found useful is to actually look at the people behind these organizations rather than the organizations themselves. themselves. Some of them stay around for a long time, like the ADL, the SPLC, the NAACP, things like that. But a lot of the smaller ones, they come and go. They're like butterflies. Kornfeder replies, well, as I said, the Communist Party simply had no experience on the subject of getting at the Negro. Originally, it was started from scratch, so it was experimenting. Even a totalitarian party has to learn from practice. It can't take wisdom out of a bottle. So they had that problem of learning how to work amongst the Negroes. That was one factor in their changes. But another more important factor, which accounts both for some of their success and their failures, is that the Communist Party in the United States can't push through a consistent policy on matters of strategy. It can be consistent on the subject of general objective and doctrine, but on matters of strategy and tactics, it has to accommodate itself to the changes that are imposed from Moscow due to the changes in Soviet foreign policy. So in 1925, when they created the first Negro Front, which they called the American Negro Labor Congress, they aimed only to get at the Northern Negro. They hadn't invented the theory of racial nationalism. They wanted to get at the Northern Negro, the Negro factory worker. So they named the organization accordingly, and they called it the American Negro Labor Congress. Up to 1930, much of the literature that they published addressed to the Negro was issued under the auspices of the American Negro Labor Congress. If they had issued it in the name of the Communist Party, it wouldn't have been read. Or if it had been read, it would have been read by a very few. But they issued it under the auspices of a Negro organization. Well, that of course had a better reception. Well, by 1930, they already had the new theory of racial nationalism. So they broadened their whole approach to the Negro and created a new organization, which they called the League of Struggle for Negro Rights. That new front had already the racial nationalism as a strategic objective, that is, the creation of a Negro Republic. But even that was sort of hard going, especially with these new theories. So by 1936, that's when the Trojan horse got going in real earnest, of which I have spoken to you before. A condition was created where Hitler was considered the main menace, and Stalin hadn't been able to make a deal with him. So Stalin decided to court the democracies, to see whether he could get together with the democracies against the Nazis. And in order to do that, well, they had to drop some of the type of agitation and propaganda that was very irritating to the democracies. And the idea of a Negro Republic down south was one of the irritants. And of course, another irritant was some of their other propaganda to the factory workers. So in order to carry out the new policy of courting the democracies against Hitler, they created amongst the Negroes a type of front patterned to this new policy. They called that the National Negro Congress. Now, to the National Negro Congress, there were invited all other Negro organizations, the NAACP, the Socialists, the Negro organization led by one Randolph, president of the Sleeping Car Porters Brotherhood, and others, and they came together all in one convention and agreed to form a new type of Negro organization, which united all existing Negro organizations in one combination, without, however, each of the separate organizations dissolving themselves. But they came together into one coordinating body known as the National Negro Congress. Well, at this time, the administration in Washington was favorable to all this. It was a period where the Trojan horse didn't have to be a Trojan anymore. It had become a partner. It could move in, as it were, in full uniform. Didn't have to do it at night anymore. So the administration collaborated with all this idea of uniting against the Nazis with the Kremlin and its subsidiary organizations in the United States. And the various organizations in the United States were refashioned, remolded to suit this new policy. Well, that's the time when the communists made their biggest headway amongst the Negroes. It was the same time when the CIO was created, And of course, the communists moved into the CIO in great style. I mean, the newly created labor organization, the CIO, issued charters to the communist labor union groups that they knew were composed of and led by communists. Well, in the name of these newly chartered, newly issued national charters, they then, of course, got at the Negro in northern industry, and through the National Negro Congress, they made some headway amongst Negroes also in the South. That was then their front. During the period when Washington and Moscow were, as it were, setting up their first big flirtation with each other, and that's the time when they made their biggest progress, and closer to the leadership of the other national Negro organizations, and produced really their most extensive literature issued to the Negroes. The slogan of the Black Republic, they just temporarily retired to the background. For the time being, it wasn't mentioned. They concentrated on the other things of a tactical nature for the time being. So just as a sidebar here, consider what this guy is saying. He's saying that the people in Washington knew something about the communist activity of these organizations, of their communist leanings. They knew that the CIO, for example, was run by people like Sidney Hillman, who, being the son or grandson of a rabbi, was actually chased out of Russian territory for being a Marxist agitator, who then came to the United States and penetrated the labor movement and started doing the same kind of Marxist agitation. So organizations like that are just, basically run by communists, even if they're not openly communist, bringing in other organizations that are explicitly communist, and Washington knowing all about this and making these overtures to the Soviet Union. The idea that there was a Cold War, has been challenged by a lot of people, but I think those challenges look a lot more reasonable when you start looking at the beginnings of this stuff and looking at the situation during the 1930s. This is not looking good for the mainstream view of history, in that there's a competition between capitalism and communism. Rainach asks, what about the People's Institute of Applied Religion? Kornfeder responds, the People's Institute of Applied Religion was one of their most cunning devices to get at the South, especially at the Negro in the South. You see, all these things I have been telling you before about the communist fronts amongst the Negro, they all operated almost exclusively in the North amongst northern Negroes. There was very little of that in the South, and the South to the communists was always one of the most vexing problems. Moscow could never understand it. The South didn't behave according to Marxist theory. Well, the economic level in the South was lower than in the North. Workmen make less. Negroes make less. According to Marxist theory, the South should be leading the United States in communist development. Well, actually, it didn't work out that way. It was just to the contrary. The South proved to be a hard nut, and it didn't conform to the doctrine. So they tried out various methods of getting at the South, and one of those, the most cunning one, was the Institute, the People's Institute of Applied Religion. They decided that the big block against the penetration of the South is religion. The Negroes believe in religion. The hillbillies believe in religion. Nearly everybody is religious. The South is more religious than the North. Therefore, maybe they could get at them under the auspices of the cross. Use religion as a cover to get there. As one of the leaders of that outfit, Claude Williams, Reverend, said, "Why use Marx to preach against religion when you could use religion to justify Marx?" That is, they would take certain parts out of the Bible where Christ chased the money changers out of the temple and say, well, Christ was against capitalism. Where Christ advocated the worth of the individual, he was against Roman slavery. They say, well, he was a revolutionary. He was against slavery, including wage slavery, and so on and so forth. Well, they began to interpret, to use the Trojan horse philosophically, as it were, and weave it into religion in order to get at the South. That was the idea of the People's Institute of Applied Religion. It was a cunning idea, but I don't know, somehow one that didn't work so well either. The left always does this, and you probably can think of numerous examples on your own. They use these deconstructive tendencies. They take things out of context and they don't apply something consistently to someone else's theory in a way that they would never, they would never turn the tables and put it directly on themselves as well. It's like how the moral relativists will criticize any moral supposition you might make, but then at the same time they're offering their own moral positions that couldn't be justified using the tools that they're offering. So this is an old tactic. Rainach asks, was not the Southern Conference for Human Welfare in the same category as the People's Institute of Applied Religion? Kornfeder replies, well, it was in the same general direction of getting at the South by using the liberals in the South and those who are concerned about the racial problem. Get them into one combination and get at the South in the name of the South, as it were. Until then, it was always some northern organization trying to operate in the South. And in fact, we know that those northern organizations that were operating in the South were, in general, big northeastern money operations that had certain ethnic tendencies and certain ethnic interests, and we're using the American Negro to support that. Let's see. Well, here they created a new approach of Southerners operating upon the South, and that one, with the support of the administration, went along pretty well. And they had great hopes until, well, the House Committee, the U.S. House of Representatives Committee on Un-American Activities, the HUAC, got it into their heads to go and have a look at it. Then the HUAC committee, of course, found what could have been found long before that it was one of the most important strategic communist operations intended to get at the South. Rainach asks, you say it had the support of the administration. Actually, Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt was one of the leaders in the Southern Conference for Human Welfare, was she not? Kornfeder replies, she was. She was one of the principal leaders at that time, yes, and so was former Senator Graham. Rainach asks, that's Frank Graham from North Carolina? Kornfeder replies, that's right. He was the chairman of it. Rainach asks, was the Sharecroppers Union a communist front or communist-controlled organization? Are you familiar with that organization? Kornfeder replies, yes, the Sharecroppers Union was a communist-controlled organization that tried to get at the Southern Negro farmer in the name of the Union. And well, it worked for a while, but it's another one of those things that worked for a while and somehow didn't work out for long. Rainach asks, to what extent, if any, did the CIO leaders support and give aid and comfort to this particular communist tactic, infiltrating in the South and getting to the public? Kornfeder replies, well, the CIO leaders followed the leadership of the administration at that time. They did the same thing. They, on the basis of this new policy of Russia supporting the democracies, they chartered and admitted into the CIO about 11 national unions, all of which were from the very beginning communist setups. Now these unions then, under the flag of unionism, went after the Negroes. The largest of them was the United Electrical Radio Machine Workers, which controlled all the important electrical equipment plants in the United States. There were quite a number of Negroes in that industry and also in the other industries. That's the first time they really succeeded under the auspices of the CIO to get at the Negro workman in the industrial field on a big scale. The communists had made various efforts in that direction before, but they didn't have near as much success as they had as a result of the CIO taking the communists in as partners. The CIO leaders were fully aware of it. I know Sidney Hillman was. And, I'd already mentioned earlier, Sidney Hillman was literally chased out of Russian territory for being a Marxist. So it's not much of a surprise that he was aware of it. This guy was a front for these operations, and so was his whole organization, right? Another thing that you could point out would be that the CIO in some places was in direct conflict with the IWW, the International Workers of the World, the Industrial Workers of the World, the Wobblies, who they were the ones who were promoting the, quote, Great Big Union. So there's alternatives here, but basically the absolute worst of the worst were the ones who were being supported by the United States government. So Sidney Hillman, he was quite familiar with the communist operations, and it lasted as long as the partnership with Moscow lasted in Washington. Rainach asks, now during this period we have been talking about, say from 1935 up until the time of the pact with Hitler and Stalin in 1939, did the Communist Party change its attitude toward the NAACP during this particular period? Kornfeder replies, well, they began to change their attitude toward the NAACP. The NAACP had, of course, grown during this period. It couldn't be ignored anymore. And furthermore, there was no reason to ignore it, because the impact of all that communist agitation upon the Negro had infected the membership and the leadership of the NAACP by then. As I said, the NAACP leaders, were there when the National Negro Congress was formed. The communists began to pay more attention to the NAACP than they had before. They had won over one of its principal officials, W.E.B. Du Bois, who was the secretary and also the editor of the official organ of the NAACP, the Crisis. He had become converted to communism. Now, regarding W.E.B. Du Bois, this book was printed in 1957, and I think a few years later, maybe in like 1961 or something like that, W.E.B. Du Bois officially joined the Communist Party. So he had been known and accused of being a communist before this point. That's why they're saying this. But later on, he was openly a member. The other thing I would point out would be that the NAACP was always a subversive organization from day one. And we know that because Jacob Schiff, the New York banker who gave, not Trotsky, but Bronstein, Trotsky, right? Gave Trotsky $10,000 cash and sent him back to Soviet Russia, and then pressured the United States government to recognize the Soviet Union once it came into existence. That guy was on the executive board of the NAACP, in 1914, I think. So it's kind of silly for Kornfeder to say that the NAACP wasn't always a subversive organization with communist leanings, because I think it's pretty clear that it probably was. Rainach asks, is this the same Du Bois that is currently honorary chairman of the NAACP? Kornfeder replies, the same one, yes, the same. He is an intellectual. He was at the founding of the NAACP, the only Negro on the board of directors. So that's the end of this section, and we'll stop for now and do some more, but then I would also want to point out that it's kind of weird that you've got an NAACP with only one black guy on the board of directors, and that black guy, W.E.B. Du Bois, was also an ardent opponent of Marcus Garvey. W.E.B. Du Bois criticized Marcus Garvey for being ugly and fat and short. Marcus Garvey criticized W.E.B. Du Bois for being a mulatto who was only like a quarter black or something like that. So again, you've kind of got all of these people on the same side. You've got the United States federal government in Washington, D.C., the FDR crowd, the New Dealers, all those kind of people. You have the Jewish bankers from the Northeast. You have the communists, literally the Soviet Union people, all on the same side. And then on the other side, you've got the anti-communists and the Marcus Garvey types. So, Marcus Garvey even, I think, had said that he would prefer a Klansman to, any of the northern politicians, because at least with the Klansman, he knew where he stood. It's kind of funny. Here you've got Willie Rainach, who is a segregationist, right? And, he's presiding over Kornfeder, literally talking about the destruction of these indigenous Negro political groups, and how the communists and the U.S. federal government was basically all in it together. So we'll do some more. I don't know how many pages we did. We started at 40 here, but we'll do some more until we run out of material in the book. Thank you for your time.